The scent of my father's aftershave was a ghost that haunted the house. It was on the collar of Mark's shirts, a faint, almost imperceptible trace that only a wife looking for trouble would notice. I started to look for other things. My mind, once a peaceful garden of domestic thoughts, became a meticulous forensic laboratory. I began to track Mark's movements. His phone was always face down on the counter. He'd started taking calls in the garage, muttering about private business and sensitive deals. When I asked him about the increased time he was spending with my father, his answers were vague, peppered with real estate jargon I didn't understand. Zoning laws, commercial leases, silent partners. He seemed genuinely stressed, which, perversely, was almost comforting. Stress meant business, not betrayal. One evening, I was making a grocery list on the kitchen whiteboard when Mark came in, looking exhausted. He was wearing a new, expensive-looking watch, a heavy, gold-plated thing that looked completely out of place on his wrist. "That's new," I commented, trying to keep my voice light. He glanced down at it, a flicker of something, guilt, pride, crossing his face. "Oh, this? Yeah, Dad gave it to me. Said it was a thank you for all the hours I've put in on the project. It's vintage, apparently." "A thank you?" I asked, my pen hovering over the word milk. He never gives gifts like that. He usually just buys a round of drinks. "Well, he's serious about this venture," Mark said, already moving toward the fridge. "He said it was an investment piece. Don't worry about it." But I did worry. My father was generous, yes, but his generosity was always loud and public. This quiet, expensive gift felt like a secret payment. It was the first concrete clue that the relationship between the two men was not what Mark was pretending it was. The next day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I drove to my father's apartment building downtown. It was a sleek, modern high-rise, all glass and steel, the kind of place that felt cold and temporary. I told myself I was just dropping off a book he'd lent me. I rang the bell, and my father opened the door, looking surprised but pleased. He was wearing a silk smoking jacket and looked every bit the charming rogue. "Darling, what a surprise!" he boomed, pulling me in for a hug. As I stepped inside, I noticed the apartment was immaculate, almost sterile. But what caught my eye was a small framed photograph on a side table. It was a picture of Mark and my father, standing side by side on a golf course, smiling broadly. It was a nice picture, but the inscription on the bottom of the frame made my breath catch. It wasn't in my father's messy scrawl, but in Mark's neat, precise handwriting. It read, "To my anchor, my partner, my one true north, 15 years and counting." 15 years and counting. That was the length of our marriage. It was a phrase we used for our own anniversary cards. But here it was, dedicated to my father. "What's this?" I asked, picking up the frame, my voice trembling slightly. My father's smile didn't falter, but his eyes narrowed just a fraction. "Ah, that. Mark's a sentimental fool, isn't he? He gave it to me when we closed the deal on the first property. Said I was the anchor for the whole venture. You know how he is with his metaphors." He took the frame gently from my hand and placed it back down. The explanation was plausible, but the warmth in his voice when he said, "Mark's a sentimental fool," felt too genuine, too fond. It was the tone a man uses when speaking about someone he truly loves, not just a business partner he tolerates. I left the apartment feeling more confused than when I arrived. The idea of an affair was still a ridiculous, unspeakable horror, but the idea of a secret was now undeniable. They were lying to me, and the lie was intimate, wrapped up in our shared language and history. The final straw came a week later. I was looking for a misplaced receipt in Mark's briefcase, a heavy leather thing he rarely let out of his sight. I found the receipt, but under a stack of papers, I found a small folded piece of stationery. It was a hotel receipt from a boutique hotel 2 hours north of the city, dated for the weekend Mark had claimed to be at the logistics conference. The room was a suite. The charge was for 2 people. My first thought was Chloe, the secretary. The familiar dull ache of a predictable betrayal returned, and I almost welcomed it. It was a betrayal I knew how to handle. I could be angry, I could cry, I could divorce him. It was a known quantity. But then I looked closer at the receipt. The room service order was for 2 glasses of a very specific, very expensive single malt scotch. The exact scotch my father always drank, and the one Mark always claimed he hated. And the second charge, listed simply as personal item, was for a bouquet of white lilies. White lilies, my father's favorite flower, the only flower he ever allowed in his apartment. The nausea from the laundry room returned, this time with the force of a physical blow. I sat on the edge of the bed, the receipt shaking in my hand, and the truth, in all its impossible, grotesque detail, began to assemble itself in my mind. It wasn't Chloe. It wasn't a secretary. It was the aftershave, the watch, the inscription, the scotch, the lilies. It was my husband and my father. And the realization was a silent, internal scream that tore through the quiet of my life.
The hotel receipt was my ticket to the truth, but I wasn't ready to cash it in. Not yet. I needed to be certain, to build a wall of evidence so high that when I finally confronted them, there would be no room for denial, no space for the plausible lies they had perfected. I didn't confront Mark about the receipt. I simply slipped it back into his briefcase, my fingers trembling as they brushed the worn leather. I became an actress in my own life, playing the role of the oblivious, loving wife. I cooked his favorite meals, asked about his investment project with feigned interest, and even suggested a family dinner with my father, just to watch the subtle, nervous glances they exchanged. The glances were everything. Before, they were the glances of 2 men who tolerated each other. Now, they were the quick, intimate flashes of 2 people sharing a profound, dangerous secret. A secret that was me. I decided to hire a private investigator. I couldn't trust myself to be objective, and I certainly couldn't trust the sweet, young secretary Chloe, who had already given me a false lead. I found a discreet, older woman named Eleanor who specialized in domestic cases. I told her the simple version. I suspected my husband was having an affair, and I needed proof for a divorce. I gave her Mark's schedule, his car make, and the address of my father's apartment building, explaining that he was a business partner Mark spent a lot of time with. I left out the part about the aftershave and the lilies. I couldn't bring myself to say the unspeakable out loud. Eleanor was a professional. She didn't ask questions. She just took the retainer and promised a report in 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I felt like I was living underwater, every sound muffled, every action slow and deliberate. I watched my children, my beautiful, oblivious teenagers, and felt a crushing wave of guilt. Their father, their rock, was a lie. My father, their beloved eccentric grandfather, was a monster. The report arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered in a plain brown envelope. I took it to the quiet sanctuary of my home office, locked the door, and sat at my desk, the silence of the room amplifying the frantic beat of my pulse. The first few pages were exactly what I expected. Photos of Mark leaving the office, photos of him at lunch with colleagues, photos of him at the gym. Then came the section titled Subject B, Robert M. The photo started innocently enough. Mark and my father meeting at a coffee shop, shaking hands, looking like two men discussing a deal. But as I turned the pages, the narrative shifted. There was a photo of them entering a small, unmarked building downtown. Not my father's apartment, but a different, more discreet location. The next photo was taken through a window, slightly grainy, but unmistakable. They were sitting close on a sofa, not discussing blueprints, but holding hands. I stared at the image, my mind refusing to process the visual information. It was a glitch in my reality. It was a photo of my husband, Mark, leaning his head against my father's shoulder, my father's hand resting gently on Mark's knee. The intimacy was shocking, undeniable, and utterly devastating. I flipped the page, needing to see something else, anything else. The next photo was taken late at night. They were leaving the building, my father's arm looped casually through Mark's, their heads close together, laughing. The look on Mark's face was one I hadn't seen in years, a look of pure, unburdened joy, the look of a man completely at ease, completely in love. The final page was a summary of Eleanor's findings. She had tracked them to the boutique hotel I had found the receipt for. She had a photo of them checking in, Mark carrying a small overnight bag, my father holding a bouquet of white lilies. The report concluded with Eleanor's professional, detached assessment. Subject A, Mark M., and Subject B, Robert M., are engaged in a long-term, intimate relationship. The relationship appears to be emotional as well as physical, spanning at least the last 6 months and possibly longer. I didn't cry. The shock was too profound for tears. It was a cold, empty space where my heart used to be. The betrayal wasn't just that my husband was cheating. It was the specific, grotesque nature of the lie. It wasn't just my marriage that was destroyed. It was my entire family structure. My father, the man who was supposed to protect me, had stolen my husband. My husband, the man who was supposed to love me, had chosen my father. I sat there for hours, the brown envelope on my lap, the silence of the house broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I thought about the aftershave, the watch, the inscription, the lies. They hadn't been hiding an affair. They had been hiding a secret life, a secret world where they were a couple, and I was just the inconvenient wife, the daughter who had to be lied to. When Mark finally came home, the key turning in the lock sounded like a gunshot. I stood up, the report still clutched in my hand, and walked out to the living room. He looked up, his face softening into his usual tired, affectionate smile. "Hey, honey," he said, starting to unbutton his coat. "Long day. The project is really heating up." I didn't say a word. I just held out the envelope, letting it drop on the Persian rug between us. The sound it made was soft, but in the silence of the room, it was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Mark looked down at the brown envelope on the rug. His smile evaporated, replaced by a look of profound, sickening comprehension. He didn't even have to open it. He knew what it was. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice cracking. It was the first time he had called me by my name since he walked in, and it sounded like a plea for mercy. "Don't," I said, my voice flat, devoid of emotion. I was beyond tears, beyond anger. I was just a vessel for a terrible, cold truth. "Don't say my name. Not with that lie still on your breath." He took a step toward me, his hand outstretched. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think, Mark," I countered.
my eyes fixed on his. It's the aftershave on your shirt. It's the watch on your wrist. It's the one true north inscription in the photo in my father's apartment. It's the scotch you hate and the lilies he loves. It's the two of you, together for 15 years, maybe longer, using me as a beard, a cover, a convenient daughter. The word 15 hung in the air, a heavy, poisoned dart. He flinched, confirming my worst, most paranoid suspicion. It didn't start that long ago. It was a few years. It was just business at first. Then it became complicated. Complicated? I laughed, a dry, brittle sound that held no humor. Mark, you married me. You had children with me. You built a life with me while you were in love with my father. That's not complicated. That's a crime against my existence. He finally looked up, his eyes wet and desperate. I love you, Sarah. I do. But I love him too. It's different. It's a different kind of love. It was always there even before we met. He was the first person who ever truly saw me. And I didn't? I asked, the question a raw wound. 15 years, Mark. 15 years of me seeing you, supporting you, building a home with you. Was every moment a lie? Every kiss? Every time you told me you loved me? No, he insisted, shaking his head vehemently. The love for you was real. It's just, Robert and I have a history, a connection. When we started working together, it just came back. It was never supposed to hurt you. It was never supposed to hurt me, I repeated, the words tasting like ash. But it did. It destroyed me. And you know what the worst part is, Mark? I could have forgiven you for Chloe, a secretary, a moment of weakness. But this is a fundamental betrayal of who I am, of my family, of my entire past. The front door opened, and my father walked in, whistling a cheerful tune. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the scene. Mark, pale and tearful, me standing rigid as a statue, and the brown envelope on the rug. What in God's name is going on here? He demanded, his voice instantly shifting from cheerful to commanding. Mark just pointed a trembling finger at the envelope. My father's eyes followed the line of his arm, and he understood immediately. The color drained from his face, leaving the deep lines around his eyes stark and prominent. Sarah, you shouldn't have done that, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Shouldn't have done what, Dad? I asked, finally finding my voice, and it was cold, sharp, and utterly unlike my own. Shouldn't have found out that the two most important men in my life have been sleeping together behind my back? Shouldn't have discovered that my husband's business trips were actually romantic getaways with my father? Which part of the truth was I supposed to ignore? He didn't deny it. He just sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound, and ran a hand through his silver hair. It was never meant for you to know, sweetheart. We were careful. Careful, I scoffed. You used our anniversary phrase for your little love nest. You weren't careful, Dad. You were arrogant. You thought I was too stupid, too blind, too much my little girl to ever look past the surface. It's not about you being stupid, Mark interjected, his voice pleading. It's about us trying to protect you. We knew this would hurt you. Protect me? I laughed again, a sound that was now bordering on hysteria. You've protected me by making me a joke, by making my marriage a front, by turning my father into my husband's lover. You didn't protect me, Mark. You used me. Both of you. I walked over to the envelope, picked up the PI report, and pulled out one of the grainy photos, the one of them holding hands on the sofa. I held it up, not to them, but to the empty space between us. This is what I saw. And this is what I want you to see. I want you to see the woman you destroyed, the daughter you betrayed, the wife you discarded. You two can have your one true north. I want a divorce, Mark. And Dad, I want you out of my life, permanently. The silence that followed was absolute. The grandfather clock ticked on, marking the end of my old life.
The confrontation ended not with a bang, but with a defeated, hollow silence. Mark packed a small bag and left that night, his face a mask of shame and relief. My father, Robert, tried to stay, tried to argue, tried to charm his way out of it. "Sarah, be reasonable," he'd pleaded, his voice losing his usual booming confidence. "This is just a hiccup. We can talk about this. You're my daughter. I love you." "If you loved me, Dad," I said, standing between him and the front door, "you wouldn't have destroyed my life to make your own more convenient. You don't get to talk your way out of this one. You're a guest in my house, and your visit is over. Now go." He looked at me, truly looked at me, and saw not his little girl, but a woman who had been broken and rebuilt in the space of an hour. He saw the cold, hard certainty in my eyes, and for the first time in his life, he backed down. He left without another word, the sound of his car pulling away swallowed by the night. The next morning, I called my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Helen. I laid out the entire story, placing the PI report, the hotel receipt, and the photo on her mahogany desk. She didn't flinch. She just adjusted her glasses and said, "This is going to be messy, Sarah. But you have the moral high ground and the evidence. We will make sure you are protected." My action was not about revenge in the traditional sense. I didn't want to humiliate them publicly. Not yet. My first priority was my children. I sat them down that evening after Mark had gone and told them the truth, or at least a carefully edited version of it. "Your father and I are getting a divorce," I started, my voice calm and steady. "He has been having an affair and it has been going on for a long time. It's not your fault, and it has nothing to do with you." My daughter, Maya, who was 16 and fiercely intelligent, looked at me with a skeptical frown. "An affair with who, Mom? That secretary Chloe?" "No, honey," I said, taking a deep breath. "It was someone closer to the family. Someone you know." When I told them it was their grandfather, the reaction was not the shock I had expected, but a stunned, confused silence. My son Ethan, who was 18 and quiet, simply stood up and walked out of the room. Maya started to cry, not for the loss of her father, but for the loss of her grandfather, the charming, large-than-life figure who had always spoiled her. "He's a monster, Mom," she sobbed into my shoulder. "How could he do that to you? To us?" "I don't know, sweetheart," I whispered, holding her tight. "But we will be okay. We will get through this." My action, my true, calculated action, began the next day. I changed the locks, froze all joint accounts, and filed for divorce, citing the evidence of the affair.
But the most important step was the one I took against my father. I knew my father's real estate business was built on a house of cards, a constant juggling of loans, investors, and high-risk ventures. He always relied on his charm and his reputation to keep the whole thing afloat. I had access to a network of people who knew him, people who had been burned by him in the past, but who had been silenced by his influence. I didn't call the press. I didn't post on social media. I called three key people: my father's biggest investor, his main bank contact, and the head of the local real estate board. I didn't tell them about the affair. I simply told them that Mark, my husband, and my father's supposed business partner was no longer involved in the project, and that I had irrefutable evidence of a profound, long-term breach of trust between the two men. I hinted at financial impropriety, at the kind of moral turpitude that would make any business partner question his judgment. I knew the whisper would travel faster and do more damage than a shout. My father's empire was built on trust and appearances. Once the foundation of his moral character was questioned, the whole structure would begin to shake. I watched the news in the following days, not for headlines, but for the subtle signs of a man losing control. A missed payment here, a delayed closing there, a sudden panicked call to my lawyer from my father's own attorney. My revenge was quiet, dignified, and aimed not at their hearts, but at their wallets and their reputations. I wanted them to lose the thing they valued most, their comfortable, secret life. The consequences of my quiet action were swift and brutal, a testament to how fragile my father's carefully constructed image had always been. Within a week, the whispers I had started had become a gale force wind. The first domino to fall was the bank. My father had been trying to secure a massive loan for a new development, a project he had been boasting about for months. The loan was suddenly denied. The bank manager, a man I had known socially for years, called me personally, not to pry, but to apologize for the inconvenience of the divorce. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the bank had concerns about the stability of the partnership and had decided to pull back. I knew then that my hint about the profound breach of trust had been interpreted exactly as I intended, as a sign of financial and moral instability. Next came the investors. My father's largest backer, a conservative family trust, withdrew their capital. They didn't need to know the sordid details of the affair. They only needed to know that the man they trusted to manage their money was now embroiled in a messy, high-stakes domestic scandal that involved his own daughter and son-in-law. The public consequence for my father was the loss of his reputation, which, for a man like him, was the loss of everything. Mark, meanwhile, was facing his own fallout. His company, a large publicly traded logistics firm, had a strict code of conduct. While the affair itself was a private matter, the fact that he had lied about his whereabouts, used company time for personal matters, and was now the subject of a highly unusual and public divorce petition involving his father-in-law was enough for them to take action. He was placed on immediate administrative leave, and within a month, he was quietly let go. The divorce itself was remarkably clean, thanks to Helen and the irrefutable evidence. Mark, stripped of his job and facing the collapse of his secret life, offered no resistance. He signed the papers, agreeing to a fair settlement that ensured the children and I kept the house and a comfortable financial cushion. He was broken, not by my anger, but by the loss of his carefully constructed stability. The most painful public consequence was the reaction of my children. They were forced to navigate the social fallout at school and among their friends. My son, Ethan, became withdrawn, burying himself in his studies. My daughter, Maya, became fiercely protective of me, but the anger she held for her father and grandfather was a heavy, visible burden. One afternoon, Maya came home from school in tears. A girl in her class, whose mother was a friend of my father's, made a cruel comment about her two dads. I held her, my own anger a cold, hard knot in my chest. "It's not true, honey," I soothed. "You have one father, and he made a terrible mistake. And you have one grandfather who made an even worse one. But they don't define you. We define us." It was then I realized the true nature of my revenge. It wasn't the financial ruin or the loss of reputation. It was the quiet, dignified way I handled the truth. I never once spoke ill of them to anyone outside of my lawyer. I never confirmed the rumors. I simply let the truth of their actions speak for itself. My father, in a desperate attempt to salvage his image, called me. "Sarah, I need you to issue a statement. Just say the divorce is amicable, that the business issues are unrelated. Just give me a clean break." "A clean break?" I asked, my voice still that flat, terrifying calm. "You didn't give me a clean break. Dad, you gave me a bomb. And now you want me to help you sweep up the pieces?" "What do you want?" he finally asked, his voice defeated. "I want you to leave us alone. I want you to face the consequences of your choices without my help, without my protection. You and Mark chose your life together. Now you get to live it without me in the way." I hung up the phone, and for the first time in months, I felt a genuine sense of peace. The public consequence was not my doing. It was the natural result of their own deceit. I had simply removed the curtain. The first year after the divorce was a blur of paperwork, therapy sessions, and the slow, deliberate process of reclaiming my identity. The house, once filled with the ghosts of a false life, slowly began to feel like home again. I repainted the living room a bright, hopeful blue, replacing the muted tones Mark had always preferred. I threw out the cedarwood cologne and the last remnants of my father's musky aftershave. My healing was not a sudden, dramatic event, but a quiet accumulation of small victories. It was the first time I laughed without feeling guilty. It was the day I realized I hadn't thought about Mark or my father in an entire afternoon. It was the moment I looked at my children and saw not the victims of a betrayal, but two resilient, strong young adults. Mark and my father were, for a time, inseparable. They moved into the small, discreet apartment downtown, the one Eleanor had photographed. My father's business continued its slow, inevitable decline. He lost the big development deal, then another, and eventually had to sell his high-rise apartment to cover his debts. The last I heard, they were living a quiet, almost reclusive life, the grand gestures replaced by the mundane reality of a relationship built on a foundation of deceit. I saw Mark only once, 6 months after the divorce was finalized. It was at a parent-teacher conference. He looked older, thinner, and the light in his eyes was gone. He approached me hesitantly. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything. I hope you and the kids are doing well." I looked at him and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just a vast, empty indifference. He was a stranger. "We are fine, Mark," I replied, my voice polite and distant. "The children are thriving. I wish you well." He nodded, a single defeated gesture, and walked away. I realized then that my healing was complete. I had not forgiven him, but I had released him. His life and his choices no longer had any power over mine. My relationship with my children became the anchor of my new life. We talked openly about the betrayal, not with bitterness, but with a focus on the moral lesson that true love is built on honesty, and that a lie, no matter how well intentioned, will always destroy the foundation. I went back to school, finishing the interior design degree I had put on hold when I married Mark. I started a small, successful consulting business, helping other women reclaim their homes and their lives after divorce. My work was not just about color palettes and furniture. It was about creating sanctuaries, places where people could feel safe and whole again. The final act of my resolution came on my birthday, 2 years after the divorce. I received a small, unmarked package in the mail. Inside was a single white lily pressed and dried, and a small, handwritten note from my father. It simply read, "I was wrong. I am sorry." I held the lily, the scent of the musky aftershave long gone, replaced by the dry, papery smell of old regret. I didn't call him. I didn't write back. I simply took the lily, walked to the fireplace, and dropped it into the flames. I watched it burn, the paper curling, the dried petals turning to ash. It was a final symbolic act of closure. I was not defined by his betrayal, nor was I responsible for his redemption. My life was my own. I had lost a husband and a father, but I had gained something far more valuable, an unshakable sense of self-worth and the quiet, fierce strength of a woman who had survived the impossible. The moral of my story was not about revenge, but about dignity. I had refused to be a victim, and in doing so, I had won. It's been 5 years now since I stood in my living room and watched my life shatter into a million pieces. 5 years since the scent of my father's aftershave on my husband's shirt became the catalyst for my freedom. I look back now and I realize the betrayal wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning. It was the fire that burned away the false foundation I had built my life upon. I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to be your anchors are actually the ones holding you back, and that the greatest act of love you can perform is the love you show yourself. The moral of my story is simple. Trust your instincts. That tiny, nagging voice that told me something was wrong, that was my true north. I had been so focused on finding a conventional betrayal, a secretary or a colleague, that I almost missed the impossible, grotesque truth staring me in the face. But the truth, no matter how painful, is always the only path to genuine peace. I lost a husband and a father, but I gained the life that is truly mine, built on honesty and the fierce, quiet love of my children. And that, my friends, is a trade I would make 1,000 times over. Would you have trusted that small, unsettling feeling? Would you have had the courage to look past the easy lie and face the impossible truth? Tell me in the comments below. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from a foundation of lies, please share your story. Your strength is someone else's hope. Thank you for listening.